So what I'm going to speak about is the relationship between labor law deregulation and specific kinds of employment practices that have got accentuated in the COVID era. Now, the pervasiveness of informal employment in India, the overall employment situation in India, these are all areas that have been discussed a lot, and there's a lot of work on how pervasive informalization is in India, or the fact that informal workers and then particularly women got excessively affected in the pandemic. What I want to do is to actually take it in a slightly different direction, which is to focus on specific kinds of developments that are related to industrial organization, the larger restructuring of capital that has been seen internationally and has also been quite significant in India in the past 5 or 6 years, and to actually look at the changes in labor law in the context of those kinds of industrial organizational changes, changes in the spatiality of production, as well as different kinds of employment arrangements that have come into existence as a result of particular kinds of industrial organization. What I'll argue is that the urgency for labor law reform is also due to these changes in the way in which the industrial organization has changed, and the commensurate changes in the world of work that have to do with specific kinds of corporate structure. Very soon after one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world was announced suddenly by Prime Minister Modi in March 2020, a slew of labor law relaxations outside of the proposed codes were announced by several states, even as a very large migrant worker crisis unfolded in the form of millions of migrant workers fleeing their workplaces to trudge home to their villages, often hundreds of kilometers away. It had become apparent that there was great urgency to implement labor deregulation in the midst of the large-scale work and livelihood crisis that the pandemic had unleashed. It had been, in the last few months, in fact, it's been announced that the labor codes will take effect very soon. In fact, they were planning to implement it from October 2021. And the government has been again and again announcing that this phase of so-called uncomplicated labor regulation in India is very essential for economic growth and, in fact, to fight against the ill effects of the pandemic. Now, this process had been set in motion in 2019 with various labor laws being brought under 4 labor codes, which unfolded gradually. And there were delays in implementation, primarily owing to strong opposition from trade unions. But the pandemic, in fact, became the opportunity to push forward several changes, primarily initiated by states. Now, despite the similar kinds of pressures for labor deregulations worldwide as part of neoliberal policies all over the world, several countries, in fact, in the pandemic introduced measures to protect employment and wages. Now, just a few examples. Pakistan introduced a relief package to bring poorest workers back to work through building natural infrastructure with something called the 10 billion trees project. Malaysia had an employment insurance scheme which provided a wage subsidy program to assist employers in retaining their workers for up to 3 months. And in fact, enterprises which received support were required to retain their employees for at least 6 months after the 3 months of support. Italy extended up to 80% of the gross salary of workers in enterprises which were facing financial difficulties, and especially to enterprises which were employing less than 15 employees, and so on. So there is quite a reasonably long list of countries which actually provided for active employment and worker support at the time of the pandemic. So India's response, therefore, has been one of the most drastic, with the pandemic seeing not only an increased apathy towards labor, but in fact, increased attacks on labor. So I'm going to actually focus on some trends that have emerged, primarily in terms of corporate structure, to make my argument. One of the developments that has taken place in the last few years has been that there's been a blurring of boundaries between the secondary and tertiary sector, with very major changes in terms of ownership and control patterns that have emerged. So, for example, in more recent years, the notion of outsourcing and contracting between firms has taken on newer dimensions. So, in addition to the usual, outsourcing arrangements that have been written about over the past 20 or 30 years, some specific changes occurred more intensively in the last few years. With the creation, for example, of what is called the asset-light model of industrial organization. Asset-light business models, where corporations own as few assets as possible, are seen to have come up as a contrast to asset-heavy, vertically integrated models, which, despite offering greater control, are bulky because they tie up significant capital and frequently prove less flexible in a fast-changing environment. So even in complex sectors like telecommunications, computer production, mobile telephony, industrial organization has been characterized by high levels of outsourcing or asset-light production and associated management practices. Companies, therefore, in a bid to become asset-light, need to keep the option open to sell assets, enter into contracts that help production but do not add assets, and tailor employment to suit these options. For example, it's become common in the hotel industry for large hotels to sell their assets and then lease them back for a variable or fixed rent to retain control. In the airline segment, Cathay Pacific and DHL share aircraft to provide combined passenger and cargo flights and streaming, and there are any number of examples in India as well where this model has been adopted. The proliferation of business strategies and arrangements in the bid to keep as few assets as possible, but at the same time widen operations, have implications for organization across industry and services, with the boundaries of company operations often blurring. So, primarily financial considerations dictate the kind of inter-firm or inter-corporation relationships that come into being, often trumping actual production conditions, and also result in companies or corporations not being easily identifiable as falling clearly under the secondary or the tertiary sector. This also results in the interlinking of real estate, financial goods and service markets in complex and fast-changing ways, creating problems of legal identification for the purpose of regulation. So given this fast-changing world of inter-corporation relationships, the workplace has undergone drastic changes. In Airtel or any of the other mobile telephone corporations, with all operations outsourced to large established firms. In fact, Airtel became the first global example to have 100% outsourcing. It's an established practice to share employees through a loose arrangement known as rebadging, wherein those employed in one firm get deployed into one where work is outsourced, allowing both firms to avoid longer-term commitments or payouts. For such arrangements, inter-firm transfers of employees become necessary without hurdles of labor regulations being encountered that prevent totally flexible deployment. So on the one hand, the chain of employers and workers associated with each level or point in the chain for any production or service activity are hard to trace, both because of the complexity and non-transparency that is created. On the other hand, companies themselves need to have particular kinds of employees and commitments of their time as well as quality in order to help it maintain control. So workforces need to be available, which perhaps explains the urgency to implement reforms, for example, in UP in the midst of the pandemic, where one of the requirements was that workers will not, that workers should actually commit themselves to the workplace. So both workforce availability as well as employment flexibility become necessary to sustain this fast-changing corporate world of inter-firm and inter-corporation alliances. So in a sense, with the large volume of floating employees and corporations with very little employment accountability, the characteristics of informal employment in the higher echelons of the corporate world are very similar to that at the bottom in decentralized industrial clusters or other forms of small scale production. So, this is the first aspect that I wanted to highlight. The second aspect that I want to highlight is the breakdown of the work worker workplace congruence that characterizes the standard employment relationship, which again has been aggravated to an altogether different level in the pandemic. Whether it's the rise of contract employment of various sorts, um, including the kind that I've described, or the proliferation of digital work and the gig economy, different attributes of the standard employment relationship, such as the bilateral employer employee relationship, standardized and legislated working hours, and provision of social security, are turned on their head. Like with asset lightness, which reduces the burden of legally enforceable employment regulation for companies, the gig economy of digital work that decentralizes jobs to the most reducible task has resulted in a significant reorganization of production and service delivery at the macro level. The reorganization of work with digital labor platforms involves an unbundling of tasks and a deepening of the division of labor, which also has a spatial dimension since it broadens the geographic boundaries of labor markets and allows operations at a global scale. So there are two contentious aspects of gig work that have been pointed out, which is the classification of workers and the applicability of sector-specific regulations to platform companies. And this is something that has become very, very critical in India. For example, companies often argue that they are mere platforms or aggregators and not employers, and those that work for them are independent contractors and not workers. Despite the government asking for estimates of the workforce in the gig economy and the Social Security Code recognizing the gig worker as a category for provision of social security, there's been no definitive official estimate of the size of the platform economy workforce. In a study that was done in 2019, there was an estimate that 11 platforms employed about 3 million workers. But that's one of the few estimates that is available. For the most part, platform work as a whole has remained largely invisible in the context of labor laws, including labor contracting. It was only in 2019 that gig or platform work even found explicit mention in a labor code, as I mentioned earlier. But those doing gig work are not acknowledged as workers in the formal sense. So the obfuscation of worker or employee status of the vast number of people employed prevents the actual availability of estimates even to be able to extend social security to them, leave alone make employers responsible for protecting their rights. And the disintegration of tasks and commensurate remuneration structures by the hour, by the gig, as advance credit to be adjusted against work done, and so on. And there are any number of different kinds of arrangements that companies are entering into with their so-called partners, and they're difficult to, they're changing by the day, literally. This combined with the absence of a defined workplace produces little accountability through the entire system, including employers, intermediaries, and the state. So what I'm pointing out, and I'll stop here, what I'm pointing out here is that the changes in labor regulations and its imperatives need to be understood also in relation to how industrial structure is changing. And this, the government's commitment, therefore, to capital is absolutely unequivocal. And that's something that has been revealed very clearly in the pandemic. So even if the trends that I've talked about just now with respect to the fast changing world of intercorporation relationships might constitute only a small segment of the industrial and service world, the need to keep employment as less burdensome as possible for employers is paramount. Even the complete crisis of employment and livelihoods in the pandemic does not seem to have dented that need, in contrast, in fact, to many other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumangala. May I now request Chirashri to take the floor?
Thank you, Vikas. Good evening, everyone. I'm very grateful to Ideas for giving me the privilege to speak on this panel. I will focus on the crisis of social reproduction and how it has led to labor cheapening, intensifying labor cheapening during the pandemic, and thus and in turn has led to uh, more and more extraction of surplus value through a process of cheap through this process of labor cheapening. So, social reproduction, which is the reproduction of social relations as a whole in any society, is subsumed under capitalism for maximization of profits through the maximum extraction of surplus value. This is done in two ways. The first is through increasing what is pure unpaid work uh, to sustain the worker and the workers' families. And the second is to, of course, extend the unpaid labor time within paid labor time in the classical Marxist sense. Now, in India, social reproduction is mainly work is mainly performed by women and Dalits, and this social reproduction work in India is not limited to the focus on care work that is usually the concern in the advanced capitalist world. Instead, the boundaries between socially reproductive work and productive work is very thin. So, for example, uh, gathering firewood, raising poultry, goat rearing, or growing vegetables for subsistence, all of this, as long as it is for subsistence, is pure, of course, unpaid work, but is on the cusp of the boundary between reproductive work and productive work. Now, in this, the social relations through which this entire structure is arranged is based on a combination of the interlinkage between caste and patriarchy, as pointed out by Ambedkar, which is control over the woman's body and her labor, in order to do two things. The first is to maintain the purity of caste through endogamy and exogamy uh, practices, and the second is to control the labor of Dalits. And though caste has been theorized in many ways, from Ambedkar to Gopal Guru, a long range of theorists of caste, the one thing that has been overlooked in this writing on caste is the in the graded hierarchy, to take Ambedkar's conceptualization, the caste and patriarchy together create a substantive command over extraction of unpaid work and unpaid labor time uh, from by those who are above in social status from those who are below. And so this ability to extract such work leads to uh, uh, a social reproduction being done at a very, very cheap rate. So labor can be kept cheap. And so, in that sense, caste and patriarchy co constitute social relations of class in the Marxist sense, in a way in which labor cheapening becomes the sole basis of capital accumulation in India. And so Mangala gave enough examples to show the various ways in which this labor cheapening is happening in the productive sectors. Now, to the point where for every 10 rupees of value that is created in the economy, just less than 18 paise goes to labor. And the for every 100 rupees of value that is created today, 65% goes as surplus, while just 35% is that of that constitutes wages. It was just the opposite in the 1990s, when 35% was the surplus and 65% was wages. So you can see the extent of labor cheapening that has already happened in the pre-pandemic phase. And to give you some example, I'll just give you some data from a survey that is ongoing. We started this survey of domestic workers. We started with 1,800 domestic workers in South Delhi, which is southeast, south, and southwest districts. and 300 sanitation workers in 2018-19. Mainly these were either Bengali Muslims or Dalits and OBCs from UP and Bihar. Now, of course, it goes unsaid that they were all paid very low wages, and the wages were often, and we are talking about part-time domestic workers here, and the total wages were less than the minimum wage. And so was the case with sanitation workers who either worked in residential colonies or in institutions, various institutions in South Delhi. The second is we found the extraction of unpaid work in different ways by assigning additional duties. So, for example, in the institutional context, the sanitation worker, apart from doing sanitation work, was made to sort of rearrange furniture, attend mm, uh, to work as what would be usually done by office attendants, and a range of other things like being pulled in to make arrangements for any kind of event, etc. Similarly, in the case of domestic work, there's also a lot of work that is imposed on women, which is not part of the initial oral contract. Now, all of this extraction of unpaid work within paid work, makes social reproduction cheaper, and thus wages can be cheapened, leading to a larger surplus. Now, uh, how important this is to capital is reflected in the fact that FICCI has been opposing any kind of uh, recognition of unpaid work of women, and especially of domestic labor, since the 1950s. From the 1950s till the time when Maharashtra passed the Domestic Workers Act in the 1990s, it has been constant in its opposition, a vociferous opposition to any kind of recognition of domestic work. Further, given the social status of the workers that we have surveyed, what we found was that incidents of lynching, mob violence against minorities has led to significant displacement and created insecure citizenships for them. And so, even the citizenship rights, not only their rights as workers, which don't exist, even the basic citizenship rights are challenged. In this situation, during the pandemic, during the first lockdown, since 2020-21, we started following up with these workers we had interviewed and talked to before the pandemic, and we could get in touch with only 755 of the 1800 domestic workers and 202 out of 300 sanitation workers. And what we found was that a 50% had undergone full loss of wages during the two lockdowns. 90% had experienced partial loss of wages. 30% had lost their jobs totally and tried to return home. And it's difficult to calculate actually how many tried to return home, because some people in the process have become untraceable. We could confirm that about 1% of people whom we could contact during the first phase had died in the process of trying to go home. And some people had found work elsewhere at lower wages, or they had gone elsewhere as but they could not complete their journey and tried to come back again. There were workers who had actually in about 20-25 case studies that we did we found that workers went back to their original professions, but at rates lower than what it was before the pandemic and for longer hours. So precarity, displacement, insecure citizenship, and not being even covered by the little bit of whatever was done during the pandemic. And I'll give you just two examples. One is that only 30% got access to rations during the pandemic, and these rations were mainly provided by political organizations and civil society organizations. what was provided by the government did not reach them. The second was that none of them, not a single one, could be were registered on the eShram portal till when we spoke to them last, which was in December 2021. So the distributive burden of work, on one hand, of course, during the pandemic, shifted to middle class women of work of social reproduction, but working class women who worked at uh, in the in social reproduction started working at not only lower rates, but along with sanitation workers, they face job loss, delays in payments of wages for more than 2 months or 3 months throughout the period, and were never paid full wages. So, in this period of the pandemic, actually, extraction of unpaid work has increased to an extent where the labor cheapening process in social reproduction has led to the process which we have seen at the macro level, which is the compression of wages. The compression of wages that has been possible has one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the major reason, but which often goes unacknowledged, is because the workers in the social reproduction sector have been super exploited to the point where uh, the freezing of wages, wage cuts, or etc., have been easy to implement because the cost of social reproduction has been entirely borne by these domestic workers and sanitation workers, the two sectors that I'm talking about. There are others too, also, which I don't have time to go into in the in. So, in terms of talking about development in the post-COVID, we are not even in the post-COVID period. We are still in the COVID period, and this COVID period seems to now now become kind of a stretchable period, and we don't know how long it will continue. In this, if we are talking about development, there are two things that need to be prioritized in the whole sort of conceptualization of alternatives that ideas and other such bodies promote. The first is it is time to look at institutions and policies which uh, don't really sort of address the question of unpaid work at all. Now, this is something that feminist economists have been arguing for a long time. But the pandemic really opens up the horrors of unpaid work in a way which is very different from that of that existed before, in terms of both intensification and degradation of human labor. And the second is that the link between labor rights and citizenship rights, which is emerging in this period uh, uh, parallelly, but the discourse is in silos. Like, those who talk about labor rights don't really look at the question of citizenship rights, while what we are seeing is that labor is not only losing labor rights under neoliberalism in India, but under the present dispensation, and in terms of, and this is not something that started only now. It is a long history that market fundamentalism has bred other kind of social fundamentalisms, that the citizenship rights of workers are also uh, at, at risk, and that has also intensified during the pandemic. So, on the policy agenda, on the institutional agenda, on the agenda for debate and discussion, the question of labor rights of workers in the social reproduction sector, and the question of citizenship rights of labor needs to be put in a way where the marginalized worker, the bulk of women and Dalits, and especially, as I pointed out, that 50% of our survey were Muslim women, Bengali Muslim women, who are often characterized as Bangladeshis, and further that makes them in a very puts them in a very precarious condition in terms of uh, a constant fear of being displaced. So these two aspects of labor rights and citizenship rights needs to be brought forward in terms of our moving forward in a direction which will be a pro-labor and a progressive uh, development strategy in the COVID era. Thank you.
Thank you, Chirashri. Sorry, I'm sorry. Some people were not able to listen to the audio very clearly, it seems, but I didn't have that problem. So I was not sure if it's okay to disturb you in between. But let's go over to Deepa. Deepa, are you there?
Yeah. Thank you, Vikas, and
Yeah, yeah, your voice is clear. Yeah.
Chirashri's voice was also clear for
Yeah,
me.
it was clear. Yeah, all right.
So thank you for inviting me, and it is indeed, like the other said, a privilege to be part of this panel. Totally my gain. I'll just take off in a way from where Chirashri ended, where she talked about labor rights and citizenship rights, and focus mainly on citizenship rights. Whether I know she focused more, she was probably alluding more to the civil political rights, but also the social economic rights of citizens. Where in this context that we have just heard of, both from Sumangala and Chirashri, about how the labor relations are changing to become more exploitative, that the role that what we call welfare schemes or the social sector plays in improving people's lives, and that this has been, the COVID period has been a period where this has been quite important. So I'd just like to talk a little bit about what we've been seeing going on in these areas, and from that lead on to what I think should be done. So like we know, the whole COVID crisis has been one that's come at the back of, like we've seen, these processes of increasing inequality, growing unemployment, contractualization of work, and so on. So therefore, along with the health crisis, it also has brought an economic crisis. Along with that, a crisis of food security, education now with schools being closed for over 2 years. And one basically sees that especially those belonging to marginalized groups, those in the informal sector, have not able to cope with the pressures that this pandemic and the associated lockdowns have brought. So we've been doing a number of surveys. We don't have the data for what we've done post the second lockdown, but various surveys between the between the two waves around end 2020 showed that over 2/3 of the people who were included in different surveys conducted by the Right to Food campaign, by Azim Premji University, and so on. In all of these, over 2/3 of people reported that their food security situation in the end of 2020 was worse than what it was before the lockdown. And like we know, before the lockdowns, it was not a great situation. India has for very long had some of the highest malnutrition rates in the world, highest rates of anemia. The recent National Family Health Survey also shows an increase in anemia prevalence in the country. We know from experience working in different parts of the country, although we don't have the data yet, that post the second wave, the current situation is even worse because employment did not get back on track, and already there were very high levels of unemployment before that. But without focusing too much on what the crisis is, which I think all of us are now quite familiar with, I want to actually talk about a few things that I think we learned, which many of us and maybe most people on this meeting already knew, but something that it's out there for everyone to see. Over these 2 years, certain things that I feel we learned, and which need to be seen as an opportunity as we go forward and we think of this from crisis to development, and how we think about development. Firstly, I think the importance of the what's called as the social sector or the welfare schemes is something that has also come out quite clearly in this time of crisis, that the social sector is not just a residual, it's not just for those people who are left out from this so-called process of development, that you give them a pension or you give them some subsidized rations, but that one can actually look at all of these sectors which provide care and care jobs as being quite central to the process of development and how it happens, the kind of burdens that it places on people, and that links to what Chirashri and Sumangla spoke about as well. For example, in these surveys, we find that the group which is relatively cushioned against this kind of the crisis of employment has been those who did get the free grains under the public distribution system. Like Chirashri said, there are many who have been left out as well. This was not universal, despite a number of demands and recommendations that during this time of crisis, at least, that it should be universal. But all the studies are showing that those who had the ration cards at least did get the free rations. Although it was only food grains, it was only cereals and not the other food groups. And often we hear narratives of people saying that that is what kept them away from starving. Along with that, although they were for very short periods, a number of governments and much more by civil society and NGOs and a lot of citizen initiatives, the provision of cooked food through community kitchens, the few months where additional ration pension was given, all of this is something that at least reached people who were already on these lists. And from that, we, I think, learned two things. One is that this often argument that we hear about how these schemes are completely useless and leaky and of no use, that kind of effectively got countered, showing that what we needed was not really withdrawal of the PDS or the NREGA, but in fact strengthening them even more to make them truly universal. So we both, I think these schemes got vindicated, and it also got, the point also got highlighted that there were gaps, of course. And the gaps included not having enough resources being allocated to them and having great exclusions, because the PDS particularly is not a universal scheme. And this again becomes even more stark when we think about the fact that throughout this pandemic period over the last 2 years, the stocks in the FCI godowns have been at record high. Even now, as we speak, almost 90 million tons of rice and wheat, some in the form of paddy and some in milled rice, is sitting in the godowns of the FCI, despite this additional 5 kilos of free grains being given now for over 6 months, and also in 2020 and 21. But so it also showed that it is not really a problem of not having the resources, but it is in fact the problem of what Sumangla said, that the government's commitment to capital seems to be unequivocal, but the recognition of this huge workforce in the unorganized sector and the kind of support that they need and are entitled to being ignored. But having said that, like I said, I think it's still a strong lesson that cannot be denied, that these schemes work and that they would work better if they were universal. That is the way that you can actually avoid exclusions. I think another lesson that we learned, which we need to speak about more as well, is that public systems, while they have been under-resourced and therefore have all the problems that they come with, like hospitals having staff vacancies, having poor infrastructure, not having the medicines and the diagnostic facilities available, and so on, it was the public sector that delivered to whatever extent that it did, especially in the initial phases. When COVID came and one did not really understand what this whole virus was all about, we found that the response of the private sector was to basically shut shop, to refuse to take patients, and to charge extremely high amounts of fees in the hospitals, making it unaffordable for people to access them. It was really the public hospitals and the health centers across the country that really did what they could. Of course, given the fact that there have been years of negligence, what they could do was quite limited. But at the same time, I think that is another sort of lesson or something that we saw happen in this last 2 years. Same one can say in terms of vaccination delivery as well. Of course, vaccine production, there's a whole other story to it, which many people, Jayati included, have been writing a lot about. But finally, that people who got their vaccines, that we were able to roll out this kind of vaccination program, despite all the confusion, once the clear message was given that it will be available in the public sector and will be available for free, you saw that that happened, whereas the private sectors, despite being allowed to charge these high amounts for the vaccines, has really failed in doing their share in the vaccination. So a number of ways in which we saw, again, that the public sector in the delivery of these services can be very effective, and where it has not been not because there is something inherently inefficient in public sector, rather because it has been a neglected area with now decades of not being allocated sufficient funds and resources for these to be strengthened. Instead, what we have been seeing is the processes of privatization being set foot in both these health and education and so on. So through the pandemic also, we saw that kind of a tension in the vaccine program. You see it through the pandemic, where in different states, governments are still putting out RFPs for PPPs in running district hospitals, in running medical colleges and so on. Or in education, the whole push for digital education. But actually on the ground, when you look at who responds, where are people able to go, it really should bring our faith back in the public system. And because people are being pushed to it, even if it is not their choice, we do see a shift happening with more people having gone to public hospitals. And also now we have data which shows that because people were not able to afford fees, many small private schools have closed down. There is also an increase in enrollment in school education in government schools. So for me, once again, that is something that needs to be seen as an indicator of which direction we should go in future, which is would be towards strengthening these public systems. However, unfortunately, what we see is that we've had one budget post-pandemic in 2021. We see that the government's priorities still don't seem to turn towards these sectors, despite this kind of times that we are in, despite the fact that across the world, you see governments now spending, willing to have higher fiscal deficits. So therefore, again, an opportunity that you probably don't have to be so scared that all your finance will run away, but still not willing to do that. So if you looked at the budget in 2021, we saw that certain very critical schemes like the ICDS, which addresses young children and pregnant lactating women, school midday meal programs, all these schemes in real terms, the budget, if we compare with 2014-15, has been cut down by 30% in real terms. If we look at the budget for the health sector, at least that is one area where we would have expected a tremendous increase in budgetary allocations, given that we are in the middle of a pandemic. We saw no increase in the budgetary allocation last year. And rather what we saw is, again, trying to hoodwink people by including a budget for a water and sanitation program within the health budget. Once again, water and sanitation, very important. But if people remember, because they included that amount, the health minister was able to say that the budget for health increased by over 130%, and that became the headlines after the budget last year. So I was just looking at how much of that Jal Shakti budget has been spent, and the data is available till end of November, and only 31% of this Jal Shakti budget also has been spent. If we look at all the other ministries as well, by end of November, education, less than 50% of the low budget that was allocated being spent, women and child development around 50%, social justice, only 11% of the budget allocated for 2021 for social justice has been spent so far. And we talk about investments on social sector, therefore clearly there is a need to increase them. I think one area that kind of also came out and was highlighted, and which links to what both Chirashri and Sumangala spoke about, is the conditions of work of frontline workers who are doing this task of social reproduction for the government, Ashas, Anganwadi workers and helpers, midday meal cooks and helpers and so on. Where you see that the processes of labor cheapening that Sumangala spoke about, that's happening in industry, is something that's happening actually in government also, where you have these newer forms of contractual arrangements, where workers are not workers. Asha workers are called activists, they get an honorarium. Anganwadi workers are called volunteers, they get an honorarium. They are not even considered to be full-time. They're not even considered to be employees, full-time or part-time. Whereas during this period, ASHA workers particularly worked for more than full time, worked in the nights, visited homes, conducted surveys, did follow-up, did a lot of work, which would, and still do not even earn minimum wages in most parts of the country. Although they did, through doing all this work, also collectivize, they've unionized, and there have been protests, and they've made some small gains with some state governments now giving them a regular monthly pay. They've not been really regularized anywhere, but they've not been recognized as government employees, even when they're doing such critical, crucial work. And at this time, and even before that, if all our improvements in infant mortality and so on happened, it has happened because of these frontline workers contributing majorly towards it. So recognition of frontline workers, as well as we talk about greater investments in the social sector, is something that's very important. So as I wrap up, what I would call for is, in this process of crisis to development, to look at this whole hope that the world and the country in India looks at this experience of the pandemic and the crisis that it brought about also as an opportunity to question the way we've understood and with the way we've been doing development, and move towards a development where the care economy, people who provide care, care services are at the center, and really something that, again, I hope Jayati will talk about, where people like her have been calling for a rainbow recovery, which is not just green, but multicolored, where care is also at its center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for raising these extremely important points and putting them so succinctly. In fact, it's quite incredible how, despite, as you said, the fact that India had these social security programs, something like an NREGA or a public distribution system. It's unbelievable. To think what would have happened if we didn't have these programs, even with all the weaknesses and all the attacks that have been made on these programs for the last 3 decades. These programs have been so critical over the last 2 years. And in fact, the important role that many other public institutions, public health institutions, but also, public enterprises of various kinds have played in preventing a calamity that COVID pandemic has, it has been, but to containing the loss. Let us now go over to Jayati to and request her to take this conversation further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikas. And I have to say, it is such a pleasure to come after these brilliant interventions, because I think all the important points have been made. And so I'm really going to just, provide a kind of footnote to try and put this in a broader context. I think what's really remarkable is the fact that this policy response, I think everyone has mentioned it, Sumi, about how even the legal codes and the regulatory practices have been dominantly oriented towards large capital and towards destroying the few labor rights that still existed. The massive increase and reliance on unpaid labor that Chirashri talked about. And of course, the inadequate spending on the most essential public services, which we already underspent on massively. And now we are really one of the outliers in the world in terms of not increasing it. I want to situate this in terms of another really extraordinary feature of the Indian economy, which is our macroeconomic response. We are probably the only country in the world in which fiscal spending declined during the pandemic. In the pandemic year 2021, our overall government spending by the central government did not increase, it fell. Now, other than countries facing extreme sovereign debt problems and IMF conditionalities and so on, you will not find any other government that has done so voluntarily. And this is remarkable. So there's the political economy of this, which we can talk about, but let's just look immediately at the macroeconomic implications. What does it mean? In a situation in which you have a major contraction of the economy caused by a lockdown, caused by a dramatic denial of the ability to earn to almost your entire population, And therefore, a private sector that is clearly going to be unwilling to invest or to even keep up production because of the massive decline in consumption demand, the supply chain constraints, and the uncertainties. The only agency that can actually somehow shore up domestic demand is the state. Now, governments across the world recognized this. Okay, the advanced economies spent anywhere between 15 to 30% of GDP, that much additional spending. On average, the advanced economies spent about 12.5% of GDP beyond what they normally spent. In the other BRICS countries, in the developing countries in the G20 also, you find significant increases in spending. Not a huge amount, but between 6 to 8%. Okay, not huge amount compared to the advanced economies, but still very large. The only other example is Mexico, which did not increase spending that much, but still by 1.5% of GDP. But in India, we now have data from the Indian government, which is telling us that they spent less. Now, this really means that the government was effectively adding to a contractionary impulse in the economy. And so, in addition to the fact that you are not meeting the basic social economic rights of citizens, you are also inhibiting the possibilities of economic recovery of the small and medium enterprises that employ 85% of the micro, small and medium enterprises that employ 85% of your workforce. You are providing a complete macroeconomic de-stimulus, if you like, that adds to all the contractionary elements. And therefore, for any economy to recover in this situation is that much harder and is going to take that much longer. So any recovery that is happening today in the Indian economy is happening despite rather than because of the government strategies. Now, this of course reflects itself in many different aspects. The inadequate health expenditure that Deepa talked about, the very little and insufficient increased allocation to the rural employment guarantee, which was the other lifesaver, the only other lifesaver along with the minimal food security that was provided. The other lifesaver was the public employment program in rural areas that provided at least some basic support to the local populations and to migrant workers who were forced to return home and so on. But even this was way below the requirement. And it really meant that the program itself did not get the funding it needed even in the pandemic year. And it continues to be in deficit. The government is still bleeding it of resources. State governments are still not being given the resources they need even to pay for the expenses they have already made. And so this is a program that is being starved, even though it is absolutely essential for maintaining livelihoods and so on. The implications for education. Across the world, governments are spending more on education because the shift to a digital mode requires much more investment. And in a country like India, where the digital divide is so enormous, where digital literacy is so inadequate, you would need huge increases in spending to just give even minimal access to your school-going population. None. We actually reduced spending on education because it said, oh, schools are closed, no need to spend. I mean, the list goes on, but it's not just in these specific centers, and it's not just in the macroeconomy, the macroeconomic implications that I've talked about. It's also that, you know, what this means is that we really have no framework for dealing now with emergencies or extreme contingencies of any kind. And let's not kid ourselves. Yes, this pandemic is not over yet, but this is not going to be the last pandemic. This is not going to be the last natural disaster or catastrophe to hit either India or the world. And again, across the world, governments are recognizing this, putting in place or seeking to create structures and institutions that can cope with response to such emergencies and calamities. Once again, here we have the opposite. We have a center at war with the state governments, which is denying them either the ability to make decisions and denying them financial resources, which are rightfully theirs, not giving them the capacity to join in decisions that affect them. And therefore, you have actually a recipe for real disaster when we are faced with the next crisis, which is inevitable. This is part, I mean, of course, India, as I said, stands out. We are, I would say, really an extreme outlier in terms of this really cruel and callous economic response. But we are not alone. You know, across the world, one aspect of this pandemic has been a massive increase in inequality, which results from the fact that governments have generally privileged profits over people. And this has come out in many different ways. The vaccine apartheid that has been talked about is very much an example of this. But it has come out also in other aspects of regulation, of public spending practices, of public taxation policies, and so on. So let's just look in India, which are the ways in which large capital and the interests of large capital have been given priority over people and the rights of citizens. Of course, it's no longer fashionable to talk about the rights of citizens, but they still exist, I hope. Intellectual property rights. India was part of a group with South Africa that fought in the WTO for a waiver on the intellectual property rights regime that inhibited the spread of technology for COVID-19 during the pandemic. So we played a good role internationally in that. What did we do domestically? We did not actually allow the dissemination of the vaccine technologies that existed in the public domain, such as Covaxin, which was developed by the ICMR, but was nonetheless given to one single company, and where the subsequent decision to allow a wider production of this came very, very late, to the extent that those vaccines are still not available, produced by other companies, even though the technology should have been in the public domain. It was largely publicly produced. We have enabled, I think Sumi talked about this, massive further privatization. We have encouraged and positively pushed further deregulation of all markets, and in many different ways, for labor, for the rules under which capital plays and invests, for environmental protection. We have actually reduced all of these other protections and limits. Financial liberalization as well. We have added to tendencies of basically deregulated finance moving in ways that operate against the larger social and economic interests and operate against macroeconomic stability, increase our external and internal financial fragility. We have enabled digital monopolies. In fact, we've positively pushed them by putting so many public services hand in hand with these digital monopolies, which operate increasingly to add to surveillance without necessarily adding to the ease with which individuals can actually access their rights and the amenities and facilities that should be available. And we have done all of this in ways that reduce both the power and the bargaining power of workers and the basic democratic power of citizens, and increase the power of corporates and of the state. Now, tax policies, we actually gave a major benefit to corporations just before the pandemic in 2019, a massive decline in corporate tax that gave a windfall benefit of, I think, nearly 2% of GDP to large corporations without generating any increase in private investment, mind you. At the same time, as the government throughout the pandemic kept increasing the prices of fuel through the indirect tax measures, and therefore put the burden of all of this pandemic spending, non-spending even, on individuals, on people, on ordinary persons who had to deal with these increased prices coming through increased fuel prices. So in every possible way, it is policy that has driven the inequality. So let me repeat, it's not the pandemic that has increased inequality, it is policies, it's policy choices. And so then the question is, why these policy choices? Well, obviously the sort of banal answer staring us in the face is that these policy choices are made because of the greater lobbying power of corporations, the fact that today in India, our political funding system has become so opaque that we have a kind of institutionalized bribery in the form of the electoral bonds, which enables companies to demand their pound of flesh in ways that are completely unseen by citizens. But that's not the only reason. governments can do this, or this government can do this because they can get away with it, because we are not getting, if you like, the broader angry protests that many of us would have thought would be inevitable in a situation like this. Yes, we have seen individual mobilization in particular sectors. I think Deepa mentioned about Anganwadi workers and nurses in different parts of the country. But this is after very, very extreme exploitation and suppression. And even the attempts that we are seeing are very difficult in a situation of such labor surplus, of such a decline in employment availability, that really workers have almost no bargaining power at the moment. And so it's really harder to mobilize and to generate any kinds of active employer response in return. So the government is doing this because it can. And of course, this then means, well, then what are the limits to this happening? Are there any limits? Is it just going to get worse and worse until everything is a complete disaster? So this, again, I would like to situate this within the broader scheme of capitalist accumulation in general. And I think this, again, India is an extreme example of what is possibly happening to capitalism globally, which is that it is an extreme phase of capitalist decay in which capital has become too powerful for its own good. There's nothing inhibiting it. Regulation, different powers of, countervailing powers of trade unions or other kinds of citizens' lobbies or anything, any kind of public provision, like Deepa talked about, the attempt to ensure that, people recognize the significance of care that Chirashri talked about. None of these is able to exercise adequate countervailing power. So capitalism is untrammeled. The difficulty with capitalism being untrammeled is a bit like the prey-predator relationship. I think all of you know this analogy from biology, that when predators eat too much of their prey, then it becomes a problem. Then they start to starve. And in a sense, this is what's happening to capitalism, that this massive inequality, which is generated, as I mentioned, by policies, this is creating a real problem of inadequate demand. And therefore, you get more and more of an impetus to extract larger shares of this smaller pie. So you get more emphasis on increased exploitation, on increased absolute surplus value extraction, on maximizing whatever you can get, making people pay for air, for water, for everything, privatizing more and more basic amenities and services, privatizing knowledge, trying to extract from this dwindling pie. Again, this has limits. And so I think, in a way, what we're seeing today is this sort of extreme, dead cat bounces of global capitalism expressed in very sharp form, in a very extreme form in India, whereby the sheer power of large capital has enabled a kind of exploitation that would be unthinkable even a couple of decades ago. Even in an earlier neoliberal phase, this would have been unthinkable. Yet this is what we're seeing. But this inevitably has limits because it cannot generate the kind of growth and accumulation, which is the raison d'etre of capitalism. And capitalism is all about growing, accumulating, right? More and more GDP all the time. If it can't do that, then it's caught in a bind. And I think that's the kind of bind that Indian capitalism also is going to find itself in more and more. There is a way out. It doesn't necessarily have to be, this extreme, massive, violent overthrow. In fact, it's unlikely to be, but there is a way out, even in terms of bringing back the countervailing powers, bringing back the regulatory practices, the power of unions and citizens associations and others, bringing back the public provision of essential services and public and basic needs and so on, which would act to prevent otherwise what looks like fundamentally a bit of an apocalypse. Okay, on that rather dire note, let me stop here, and I'm sure there will be more questions and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jayati. Thank you for these very important points. As you were talking, I was thinking that in a week from now, we are going to have the central government budget being presented, and many of these issues that you raised actually provide us a perspective from which to look at that budget, and to gives us things to look for when we listen to the finance minister. So there are a few questions already, and I'm sure more are going to come as we go. Let me read out these questions, and you can start thinking about your responses, and let's see if we have some more. So there's a question for Sumangala. And this person's written that he would like to hear more on monitoring and supervision when it comes to labor compensation. Also, is the rapid contractualization of labor happening side by side with broadening of the gig economy? Is it formalization of informal sector or informalization of the formal sector? How should one see it? Do these gig economy workers join their jobs because as victims of a speculative bubble, or do they join because they have no other option? What do you consider them as? Are they a part of the circuit of capital, or they're outside the circuit of capital? There are two questions for Chirishri. So you've just touched on the relation between labor rights and citizenship rights, but you see them both being raised in silos. Any specific reasons in your view why they are not taken up together by different civil society organizations? What could be the gaps which need to be bridged to bring this to make this a central issue? There's another question. Could you comment on India's lack of a refugee policy and the super exploitation of labor from neighboring countries like Bangladesh? Is there a link between the two, creating some kind of a citizenship rent? There are two questions for Joyati. Is that you talk about government of India reducing its fiscal spending. Now, due to this pandemic, most of the people lost their jobs, and a section of people who were associated with informal sector are worst affected by the pandemic. What kind of macroeconomic policies are needed to reduce the burden of informal sector and create more jobs for the youth? And there is a related question. What do you think? What has been the extent of impact that this fiscal curtailing fiscal spending, reduction in fiscal spending has had on development of India? Is there a measure of how much impact it has had? There are a couple of more for Jayati regarding the need for countervailing power. How far can India go it alone? That is at the national level. What are the prospects for cooperation at the regional level? And thank you for giving a broader picture. Do you think a security net developed over time, say in countries like the Scandinavian countries, can be more helpful when it comes to contingency response as compared to temporal fiscal expansion? There is one more question for Sumangala. Can you please clarify on how unpaid work and the gender pay gap are interlinked? Okay, now that's quite a few questions for each of you. Shall we go in the same order? Is Sumangala still around? Sorry, since she was unwell, I don't know.
No, Sumi is here. She's here.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, Sumi, do you want to start again?
Yeah, I can. And so let me take up this question of whether it's the formalization of the informal sector or the informalization of the formal sector. Well, I think it's after a point it becomes difficult to distinguish because there's what one is seeing. I mean, of course, I think primarily what I was talking about is that what is happening in the so-called formal sector, and which we were talking about proper companies and big corporations, so these are enterprises which are considered within the formal sector, but the employment that is being generated is entirely informal in nature. And although the government sometimes would argue that because of specific attributes and specific kinds of ways in which formalization is defined, for example, if it's if there's GST registration, that it becomes part of the formal sector, but that's just a trick to say that formalization has actually happened. Whereas if you look at employment practices and the way in which work is organized, it is very classic informalization. Now, they are very much part of the circuit of capital. So what we find is that the circuit of capital, in fact, whether it's at the top in terms of the large corporations, or whether it's at the bottom in terms of often the tiniest enterprises, which are there, including home-based enterprises, are all within the circuit of capital. And often you can find the chains running from the tiniest enterprises to some of the larger and quite, in fact, the largest ones, sometimes with links to the global economy as well. So I don't think that this is really outside the circuit of capital. It is that capital has penetrated in different ways into the what one might consider the non-capitalist segments as well. Now, as far as the gig economy is concerned, I mean, all of us would have enough experience about, whether it's food delivery or whether it is, delivery services of all kinds, which have exploded in the pandemic period. These companies begin in ways in which workers get attracted to them, often by, in fact, often giving them good incentives and so on. But then as time goes by, they monitoring and supervision and this whole rating system has become so stringent. There are any number of studies which have actually shown it, that that becomes not only a method of labor control, but also a very effective way of labor shedding. So people can get picked up and dropped on the basis of these so-called ratings, and in fact, it's a downward spiral. So for whether it is with Uber all over the world, or whether it is with Zomato or with Amazon, the spiral has been downward. So those are general tendencies which have been there. I think that's about it.
Thank you, Sumangala.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, Chirishri.
Okay, there are two questions for me, and it's raining quite hard here, so there may be audio issues, but I hope you are able to hear me.
Yes.
So the first question was on this labor rights and citizenship rights being raised in silos. Now, this has a long history, right from the time of the French Revolution, when labor rights were the attempt by trade unionists, to early trade unionists and labor rights proponents, to include that in the agenda of the French Revolution, was brutally put down. You may be knowing the history, and basically it was the foundations of liberal bourgeois democracy was laid without labor rights being a constituent of citizenship rights. So that's where the history of the separation starts. And it was briefly during the existence of the Paris Commune that this was bridged, which was, of course, a very revolutionary attempt, but which did not survive, unfortunately. Since then, this question has become sort of discussed in silos for two reasons. One is the kind of specialization and hyperdisciplinarity that capitalism builds in terms of creating this idea of sectors. So those who work in the those organizations who work with labor, so-called labor sector, don't really work on the question of citizenship rights. And those who work on the question of citizenship rights from the point of, let us say, different kinds of identity politics or minority rights or rights of the marginalized, etc., don't really include labor in their agenda. This also has to do with the divide between class and identity politics. And this is something, the politics of class and politics of identity. And it is the reason I'm arguing that this gap needs to be bridged uh, is because of two reasons. The first is that class is also an identity. And so to talk about the two as binaries is a problematic. And the second, as I argued through my presentation, that all other identities go into the co-constitution of class, because the systems, the institutions of caste, patriarchy, religion, etc., go into the constitution of class and social relations. And hence it is necessary that the gap be bridged in two ways. That first, that the uh, very idea of citizenship rights needs to be broadened to include labor rights. What failed during the French Revolution, that agenda has to be raised again by people on the left, people who are progressive. And the second is that the those who are working, political organizations, trade unions working with labor, need to recognize that it is on the basis of the denial today of citizenship rights that the precariat is being constituted, which is then super exploited. And so the question of citizenship rights cannot anymore be kept, political citizenship rights, socioeconomic rights people do talk about to a certain extent, but political citizenship rights has to be connected to the question of labor rights. On the second question, the lack of a refugee policy, thank you for asking this question. See, India never signed the Refugee Convention of 1951. So, right from the days of the Nehru government to the present regime, and neither the 1967 protocol. And the reason always has been Bangladesh, that they believe that because there is a porous border between India and Bangladesh, the kind of ways in which India manages this border would be affected if it signed the convention. And hence, they never even framed a refugee policy. Now, there are refugees from other countries in India, but know that what has happened to Rohingya refugees, for example, who are, India kind of grants them refugee status under the UNHCR, and still you know their condition. On the case of Bangladesh, it has been very different, which is that it has been used in two ways. One is that the people coming, let us say, through the porous border, the border is both, it's porous both ways. So people cross from India to Bangladesh also, but that's never part of the political agenda. It's only about people who come in. And there's been no attempt to resettle them. Rather, this denial of citizenship, it's very similar to what happens to Mexicans in the US, that basically you keep them in a state of limbo as respect to citizenship, and hence they form part of the precariat, and as you call it, a citizenship rent. Yes, that this makes them amenable to doing work at very cheap levels and in inhuman conditions. Okay. But the problem here is something else too, which is that Muslims of Bengali origin who come from West Bengal, who do not come from Bangladesh, are also labeled Bangladeshis and put into the same situation as those coming in from Bangladesh. These are not refugees, these are legal citizens of India, and yet their citizenship is denied by raising the bogey of what they call Bangladeshi Ghuspetias. So it is, on one hand, it is a question of how India treats its refugees, but on the other hand, it is also economic migrants, especially. On the other hand, it is also a question of how India treats its own citizens who are from a minority background.
Thank you, Chirishri. Deepa, there is a question on school closures. Maybe you can take that.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick answer. I think it's quite obvious what school closures, education closure will do. Again, we have to look at it also in the context of the inequality in education that already exists in our country. And we know that these closures have also not impacted everybody equally, although yes, it has been, there will be a negative impact for everyone, all children and students through this period, that for such a long time, classroom transactions have not happened. But given the digital divide and given the divide again in the resources available both within families and schools, we know that this period has also expanded the inequality in education, where children growing to more expensive private schools have continued to get some form of education, and they have the devices at home to be able to access it. And in contrast, government schools across the country, there's almost nothing that has happened. Even in Delhi, where there was some activity, it was mostly through WhatsApp worksheets and so on. So I think one big concern going forward would be the inequality in education. And like we know, that would form the basis for all kinds of inequality as we go ahead. And of course, skilled labor as well, which is again already a problem. And when we think about the quality of labor, it's not just, it is education, university education training, but also nutrition and health and various other things which have taken a hit at this time, which would add to the demographic dividend not really being a dividend.
Thank you, Deepa. Now going to Jayati for her concluding remarks, in fact, and that would, I think, be the last. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks also for these very interesting and very complex questions. I don't think I'll be in a position to answer all of them. There have also been a few more coming in while the discussion was going on. Okay, let me quickly take up, there was a question to Sumangala and myself about how entrepreneurship policies affect formalization and how Atmanirbhar and all of that. Let me make clear my position on this. Formalization does not happen through diktat, and it doesn't happen through relabeling, which is really what's happening at the moment. It's relabeling. It happens when labor market conditions improve sufficiently and when the systems enable enterprises and employees to be able to access any of the benefits of formalization. So the current strategy, which is, to basically say, well, register for so-and-so portal and so on, this has almost no impact, especially in a situation where, as I've said, the labor market conditions are truly abysmal and worsening very dramatically over the last 2 years. What does that mean? It means, and this is a question I think Indira also raised and so on, what do we do then? How are we supposed to do it differently? So I think the answers are almost inevitable. It's doing the opposite of what has been done, right? Spend more. Spend significantly more, and in particular areas, right now you need to revive demand. So quite apart from the welfare implications and your duty as a state to meet the social and economic rights of citizens, which you have promised them, quite apart from that, from a purely macroeconomic perspective, you need to put money in the hands of those who will spend it so that you will have many more multiplier effects of your fiscal spending. This, incidentally, it's not just a bunch of economists from a progressive standpoint. The IMF has said exactly the same thing. Spend in places and areas which will generate the highest fiscal multipliers. What are those? The employment guarantee. We have completely underspent. If we were to meet the promise of 100 days of employment for all those who demand work, and going by the number of households who demanded work last year, we would need to spend about 2.83 lakh crores, okay? We are currently spending 70, 80,000, which is ridiculous. We are spending 1/4 of what we need to spend on just the rural employment guarantee, according to the government's own laws, okay? Similarly, we should bring in place an urban employment guarantee. We obviously need to spend more on food. Deepa has highlighted this. We need to spend much more on health. Again, this is a no-brainer. I don't have to elaborate this. We need to spend more on education. We are looking otherwise at a lost generation. And we need to spend much more on social protection. Now, again, quite apart from the welfare implications of these are all well known globally to be strongly counter-cyclical. That is to say, in a downswing, these expenditures kick in and provide a cushion for the rest of the economy. And particularly, they provide demand for micro, small, and medium enterprises. So you will actually not be losing enterprises at the rate at which you're losing them today, and employment, even informal enterprises, at the rate at which it's happening today, if you had been spending on all of these. So there's a very powerful macroeconomic implication of such spending. How can we afford it? People will say, where's the money for this? And of course, there's only this question when we talk about this kind of spending. This is never raised when people talk about giving a tax break to large corporates. But nonetheless, all right, how do we raise this money? Well, we have talked about the extreme increase in inequality. A 4% wealth tax on just the billionaire individuals of India, dollar billionaires. And we know who they are. There's a list. Forbes produces it, Deutsche Bank produces it. We have lists of those who have this wealth. A 4% tax on their wealth will give you nearly 2% of GDP, right? Which is at the moment 6-7 times the central government's health spending. It is 4 times the spending on the employment guarantee, and so on and so forth. So we can raise this if we have the political will. There is no demand for this. Why? Why have the people of India got so defeated that we think, oh, we can't ask for a wealth tax? Oh, we can't ask for a corporate tax, which is on line with the rest of the world. We can't ask that multinationals be paying their fair share of taxes. We can't ask for a digital corporations tax. We can't ask for anything. Why? Because somehow it's not possible. What is possible is a fuel tax that will come and hit every individual without any compensation. Can India go it alone? Can we do this without broader, international solidarity, if you like? Definitely it's difficult. There's no question about it. And India is in a better place than most other economies. We don't have a large external debt. We are a very large economy on our own. Access to our market matters for global capital, so they will be resistant to squeezing us. Of course, at the rate at which our economic decline continues, if we decline much further, then they would also lose interest. But right now, we are still important enough. So we have, in that sense, more economic strength than a lot of smaller developing economies. But yes, this is a time to join with others. This is a time to move in coalition with other developing countries who are also facing many of these dilemmas and problems and really need to expand fiscal spending. So we should be definitely demanding much larger increases in SDR allocation. We, along with the United States, were the only 2 countries to oppose this the first time round, unbelievably. But we should be demanding much larger non-conditional SDR allocation. We should be demanding recycling of the SDRs by the rich countries who will not use it to developing countries who will be able to use it. We should be arguing globally for sovereign debt resolution. Just because India is not affected doesn't mean we should not be part of a broader coalition. So if we want to benefit from global coalitions, we should be part of those even when they don't directly impact on India. And of course, that will require a very, very different approach, both geopolitically and in terms of solidarity with other developing countries than we have shown in the recent past, but it can be done. The role of the international institutions, absolutely important. They remain very much with forked tongues. They say one thing and they do something very, very different at every level. Global institutions, by and large, have failed us in this crisis. It doesn't mean we have to give up on them, but it does mean that progressive forces have to be much more oriented towards criticizing them from a perspective that will make them reform in the proper ways. And that brings me to, I guess, the final point. How do we ensure that a recovery is people-centric? And here I go back to, I think Deepa talked about it, that, I've been saying that we need not just a green global recovery, but we need a multicolored recovery. Obviously, it has to be green. It has to be recognizing the challenge of climate change, the destruction of our environment, and so on. It has to be blue. We have to recognize water as a critical part of our environmental challenge and separate it, I believe, because we're not giving it adequate attention otherwise in terms of both the pollution and degradation of our resources and the problems posed by different changes in the nature of water access and the inequalities of that. It has to be purple, the color of the care economy. And I think that is absolutely central to any future recovery, not only because of the huge welfare implications, the issue of unpaid work and so on, but because it is so employment generating. Across the world, you are seeing jobs being lost to supposed technological changes, where care work is fundamentally relational and cannot be completely replaced. It can be assisted by machines, but it cannot be replaced. And if you properly value the social role played by care, and you give that sufficient, adequate remuneration and respect in society, you will get a transformation not only of the living conditions of people, but of employment conditions globally, because this is actually the potential. The care and creative economies are the big employment generators of the future. And it has to be read, it has to be redistributed. Not just because that's good in itself, not just because this inequality is obscene and so on, but because, as I mentioned, this extreme inequality is dysfunctional. It gives rise to political power that is enabled to affect policies to further entrench the extremely rich and the extremely powerful at the expense of everyone else, which in turn we now know is destroying not just economies, but also the planet. So it has to be read for pure survival purposes, not just for welfare and equity purposes. At just final point, I noticed that there was a question on new welfareism. I really object to these terms. Anything that provides social and economic rights to people is suddenly welfareism, populism, and all these little bad words. Everything that gives big breaks to capital is all about growth, which is like the best thing ever. I reject these categories completely. I think provision of basic needs to people cannot be called either welfareism or capitalism. It's what governments are there for. That's what the social contract should be ensuring. The fact that when a government does it, it's seen as either something to be kind of sneered at or something to be grateful for, both are wrong. These are the duties of government, and a social contract that does not ensure that is a broken social contract that needs to be changed. Thanks.
Thank you, Jayati, for ending it so well. I'm sure everyone agrees. This was a brilliant session between four of you. We've got such a sort of comprehensive perspective on the challenges that we face in India, and what we should be looking for. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining. This was a great session. As I said when we started, Ideas is going to be organizing these conversations regularly, possibly, hopefully at least once a month, and we hope to see you again. Please subscribe to the Ideas mailing list, and look out for information on the social media handles of Ideas, so that you know when the next event is being organized. Thank you very much. Good evening, good night, have a good day from wherever you've joined in. Thank you very much to the speakers and everybody else.
Thank you. Thanks, Vikas.
Thank you, Vikas.
I want to also just thank Vikas Raval for conceiving of this, for organizing this, and for really terrific moderation. Thanks very much, Vikas.
Thank you.
Thank you.